Thanks for tuning in to Wine Blast. Sign up to Wine Blast Plus for first-class subscriber-only content to access our full archive, support the show and get every episode before it goes on free release. You'll also get subscriber-only discounts with the likes of Coravin, Jancis Robinson Glassware and Academy du Vin Library. Just visit wineblast.co.uk or click the link in the show notes. Hello, you're listening to Wine Blast, and it's great to have you with us as we raise a glass to the 50th anniversary of the famous Judgement of Paris, the 1976 wine tasting that changed the world. Well, the wine world, at least. But that's not all we're doing.
Yes, hello. Welcome to what is definitely not your classic Judgement of Paris anniversary piece. We're going to do something a bit different, as you'll discover in due course. Meantime, here's a taster of what's coming up.
The real winner wasn't Chateau Montelena or Napa Valley. The real winner was the consumer around the world. Just made wines better.
Chateau Montelena owner and CEO Bo Barrett there, touching on the wider ramifications of the Judgement of Paris, which is a hint to the direction we'll be taking this story in as we progress. And we're going to do a slightly different style of episode for this one, aren't we?
Yeah.
With a kind of split structure.
Yeah, quite right. So in the first part, we're going to explore the story behind that seminal and hugely consequential tasting in Paris in 1976. I mean, there's a reason there are so many articles and books about it, plus a Hollywood film and breaking news, now even an opera. And the reason is it's such a good story. But I also feel there are some fundamental misconceptions that need clearing up along the way. And Bo is going to be part of that story as someone who witnessed events firsthand.
But then rather than just rehashing something that happened half a century ago, we're going to transpose the key dynamics behind that groundbreaking tasting onto the modern era. In other words, if this kind of wine tasting were to happen today, who would be the winners and the losers? How has the world, and the wine world in particular, changed since 1976? How does that go beyond the US and France? And what might that mean for the next 50 years?
Helping us bring the theory to life are two fascinating tastings we were lucky enough to judge in, namely the greatest Chardonnay showdown at the London Wine Fair and the IWFS Judgement Plus 50, both held in London in May 2026. And we'll also be making reference to other similarly intriguing tastings we've done, all in the spirit of celebrating the diversity and excitement behind modern day wine.
So let's start at the beginning. And this story begins in 1970s Paris, where the streets were alive with bustling cafes, classic cars and jazz music. There was also a fair bit of wide lapel and big hair action, as the photos of the time clearly show. In wine terms, France was the undisputed master of the universe, and although Burgundy and Bordeaux weren't yet making the consistently stellar quality that would start to emerge in the 80s and 90s, their track record and reputation put them on a pedestal that few thought could be realistically challenged.
Into this Parisian tableau steps Stephen Spurrier, a snappily dressed, well-to-do and well-spoken Englishman, albeit with an endearing stammer. Stephen was a man of means, but also a man of dreams, a restlessly curious mind bursting with ideas. Not all good ones, he cheerfully admits, but with a passion for wine and a single-minded determination when push came to shove, as indeed it does in this story.
Now, we should probably say at this stage that we were lucky enough to know Stephen pretty well. He was a gentle soul, warm, thoughtful, humble, charming and generous. And the wine world lost not only a leading light, but also a very special man when he died in 2021, aged 79. We wrote a personal tribute, which we'll put a link to in the show notes. In short, this was a man who was all about celebrating wine rather than criticising it. And that's an important part of this story too, isn't it?
Indeed. So Stephen was living in Paris with his wife Bella and two small children. For part of it, they lived in a river barge moored on the Seine. which I think is very romantic.
It is rather romantic.
I think you probably have other words for it, wouldn't you? I'm not sure it's
don't
quite
love
your
it.
scene, but it is.
Possibly not.
I think it's wonderfully romantic. Anyway, he had acquired a small wine shop, the Cave de la Madeleine, in a rundown corner of posh Right Bank, Paris. But business proved slow, so he came up with the idea of creating a wine school, the Académie du Vin, to host tastings and drive awareness. He brought American expat Patricia Gallagher on board to run it. They began hosting a series of themed tastings, and she came up with the idea of an event to celebrate the bicentennial of American independence in 1976. The seed was sown.
Now, what's great about this story is it involves so much serendipity. Patricia had been born very close to where the Declaration of Independence was signed in 1776, a process in which the French, let's not forget, had been involved. And in 1974 and 1975, she tried to find Californian wines for tastings to celebrate the 4th of July, but she couldn't find them in Paris. She knew, though, that there were good Californian wines starting to emerge. So, in 1975, she extended a trip back home to tour wine country and visited the likes of Ridge, Heights, Montelena, Mayacamas and Stag's Leap. She came away extremely impressed and raved about the wines to Stephen on her return to Paris.
The question then became how to get the Californian wines to Paris. Spurrier had had a run-in with French customs before this when trying to import a few cases of English wine from Hambledon Estate when the Queen was on a state visit with French President Georges Pompidou in 1972. It had led to a standoff whereby the French customs official said he couldn't allow the import because although the cases of wine were physically in his office, he said they, and I quote, didn't exist because English wine didn't officially exist, according to his paperwork. Spurrier told him his job wouldn't exist if Georges Pompidou didn't get his wine. It was a bluster that worked, but it wasn't a reliable strategy this time round.
So a proper plan was formulated. Stephen would head out to California to make the final selection of wines. And if you do watch the Bottle Shock movie, which we should probably add that Stephen loathed, partly because Alan Rickman hugely hams up his character. These are some of the funniest scenes, as you can imagine. Yeah. Anyway, he was after small family-run wineries representing the new age of California wine, most of whom had France as their winemaking model. It all went well, apart from with Heights and Ridge, both of whom refused to see him. But Stephen, ever the relentless optimist, turned up anyway and proved so charming he was not only ushered in but also left with all the bottles he needed.
But the problem was he had too many bottles to bring back by himself. As luck would have it, Patricia had heard about a California winemaker's trip to France, including the likes of the great André Chelichev of Bewley Vineyards and Jim Barrett of Chateau Montelena. They were scheduled to travel just weeks before the Paris tasting was due to happen. Again, using all his guile, Stephen persuaded the winemakers to act as mules to bring the precious California wines over. Seeing the boxes arrive on the airport carousel in Paris, Stephen was overjoyed. On closer inspection, one of the boxes sported the kind of red stain every wine lover dreads. But it proved to be just one bottle broken, and he'd had the foresight to source 2 of each. The 1970s were a lucky decade, he later wrote in his autobiography.
So, they had the Californian wines. They also had a fearsome lineup of 9 judges, all French, all well-respected, all curious to learn more about these Californian wines. The plan was very much coming together. And that plan, it's worth clarifying because I think sometimes this point gets lost, was simply for an event hosted by l'Académie du Vin to explore and celebrate the wines of California in honour of the 1776 to 1976 bicentenary. It was never intended to be a judgment or a taste-off or a competition.
Yeah, that little detail was a last-minute idea of Stephen's. As soon as everything had fallen into place for the tasting, a thought had begun to nag at him. The tasting was intended to gain recognition for Californian wine, but the risk was that these great French wine experts would adopt a condescending position towards California and damn the wines with faint praise. So to keep them honest, barely a week before the tasting, Stephen decided to add in France's finest, top Burgundies and Bordeauxs, and make the tasting a blind one where the tasters wouldn't know the identity of each wine until after they delivered their verdicts.
A typical Spurrier plot twist. And so the drama unfolded. The judges assembled on the 24th of May 1976 at the Intercontinental Hotel in Paris. The wines were served in random order. 10 Chardonnays first, then 10 Cabernet Sauvignons. The French wines mixed in with the Californians. Spurrier had no expectations. He later said he'd have been happy with just a couple of the Californian wines in the top half. And he also said, and I quote, "It certainly would not have suited me as a wine merchant in Paris to see unknowns from California beat the benchmarks from France."
Patricia Gallagher added they had no financial interest in that outcome either, seeing as they didn't stock any Californian wines in the shop at the time. Anyway, in another piece of serendipity, Patricia happened to have mentioned the tasting to George Tabor, a journalist from Time magazine who worked just up the road in Paris and had attended one of the Academy wine courses. He only came along because it was a slow news day, but he brought his camera and notepad, and it wasn't long before he realised he might have a story on his hands.
George had a list of the wines and was the first to notice that the judges, as they chatted, were confusing the French with Californian and allocating high marks not just towards the classics. Incidentally, Stephen and Patricia's marks were not counted in the final tally. Sure enough, when the results came in, the top Chardonnay was from California, the Chateau Montelena 1973. In fact, 3 of the top 5 Chardonnays were from California. The Rouleau Merceau Charme came second, and the Ramenais Prud'homme Bâtard Montrachet 7th. Tabor writes, "The judges' reaction ranged from shock to horror. Soon the whole room was abuzz."
The judges then moved on to the Reds. The plan had been to announce all the results at the end, but service was slow. I think there was a wedding coming shortly after, so they had to get out of the room, and the tasting was running dangerously late. So Stephen had announced the whites result prematurely. He was sure the judges would now be more cautious with the Cabernets. As Tabor writes, 1 Californian wine winning was bad enough, 2 would be treason for the French judges. But when the Reds result was announced, lightning struck twice. The winner was again from California, the Stag's Leap Wine Cellars Cabernet 1973, besting the likes of Chateau Mouton Rothschild, Aubryon and Monrose. The judges sat in disbelief, wrote George Tabor.
And of course, George Tabor's role in this tasting is vital. Had he not been there to record events in the 7th of June edition of Time magazine, Spurrier wrote, "Our little adventure would probably have sunk without trace. As it was, it became the historic tasting that revolutionised wine," which is the subtitle of George Tabor's 2006 book, Judgement of Paris, which is well worth a read on both this event and the history of California wine.
It's a really good read.
Yeah.
Back at the tasting, though, Stephen and Patricia had no idea how significant this event would become. They had other things on their plate, I think it's fair to say, like Judge Odette Kahn, editor of La Revue du Vin de France, demanding her scorecards back, which Stephen politely but firmly refused to do. Stephen writes in his autobiography how she later claimed he'd falsified the scores, and the adverse reaction didn't end there. Stephen was persona non grata in certain circles for some time after the event, and was later physically thrown out of the Ramenais cellars in Burgundy for having caused such an insult to the family name. Other judges were upbraided by their employers and colleagues. Aubert de Villaine of Domaine La Romilly-Conti was accused of treachery by his own business partner, and there were calls for INAO head Pierre Bréjus to resign. This had never been part of the plan.
It was a different kettle of fish on the American side of the fence. George Tabor tracked down the American winemakers on tour and called Jim Barrett of Chateau Montelena while they were having lunch at Chateau Lascombe in Bordeaux. During the visit, the Californians had apparently been gently patronised by host Alexis Lichine about how they might one day aspire to make great wines like the French. Barrett, a highly successful lawyer, chose his words carefully when he heard the bombshell news from Tabor about his wine coming first and the triumph of the California wines more generally. Not bad For kids from the sticks, was his wonderfully dry riposte.
The Californians had to wait until they were back on the bus and safely out of earshot of their French host before they erupted, in George's words, like football fans whose team had just won the Super Bowl. As soon as they were back at their hotel, Barrett sent a breathless telegram back to Chateau Montelena informing them of the stunning success, at which point his winemaker at the time, the perennially beret-clad Mike Gergich, started dancing round the winery, shouting in his native Croatian, "I'm born again, I'm born again." And everyone, including Jim's son, Bo Barrett, thought he'd gone stark raving mad.
So this is where we bring in Bo, current CEO and owner of Chateau Montelena, a keen surfer who loved the outdoor life so much he was prepared to work with his dad on the vineyard. 54 years later, Bo is proudly still at it. Here's what he said about his memories of the lead up to the Judgement of Paris and the result.
Have you heard the surf term stoked? Yes, we were very stoked. What I remember personally about it is we really had to clean the cellar because Steven Spurrier was coming. And then our boss, Mike Gergich, the winemaker at the time who crafted that wine, he made us all disappear. I think he sent us to the vineyard. So I do not remember seeing Steven Spurrier there at that time. So we spiffed up the cellar. We took the wine. My dad sent us a telegram, and we were working in the cellar. It was a regular May day. And so we had a gravel parking lot at the time, and Mike Gergich had his beret, and he's, all of a sudden he's out in front of the winery dancing around, waving this piece of paper. We don't know what's going on, but we won. And so then we go running out there, and pretty soon we were hopping around doing the Croatian victory dance too. And that, because my father was on a trip in France, he was at Chateau Lascombe when he got the news from George Tabor, called him, right? And that's where he made the famous quote, "Not bad for kids from the sticks," because, we didn't want to insult the French because, clearly everybody in our business knew that we were standing on the shoulders of giants, or, we'd learned from our parents. It's like the first time you beat your dad at chess, or, you beat him at tennis or something like that. You don't want to, gloat too much. So to try to be, polite and graceful, that's why he just said, "Hey, not bad for kids from the sticks." But yeah, we're pretty excited. And what really affected us is at that time, business was okay. But as a result of the industrial winemaking in the Central Valley in the 50s and 60s, California's well-deserved reputation for terrible wine, we could not get anybody to carry our wines in the other major metropolitan areas of the U.S. So, you'd call some guys in New York, for example, say, "Hey, we got this good wine." And they'd say, "Yeah, sure, take a hike, pal." And but then immediately, the next Monday, they were calling us and saying, "Hey, can we get your wine?" And it was not only us, because, of course, Stag's Leap won the Reds. And so this is the revolution. It wasn't all about Chateau Montelena. So it really gave a boost to the entire Napa Valley. Any wine that was even in the tasting, there was a lot. And so you got Ridge down in Santa Cruz, and us in Napa, and I think Shalom was in there from, Salinas Valley. And so it really was it was a massive win for California. It was not just Napa Valley. Although, yeah, we had most of the fun. So, yeah, we were pretty stoked. And so, as at that time, it's just that it basically leveled the playing field where we got to, we were good players, and we got to walk on the field and have a shot to get into the market.
Okay, so much as I would love to focus on that Croatian victory dance in the parking lot of Chateau Montelena, Bo makes a really important point about the impact this tasting had. And this is the real heart of the matter. Firstly, he says it wasn't just about individual wineries so much as giving a boost to all quality Napa and California wines. So suddenly New York was calling, where before it was quite a sort of parochial wine scene where they could only really sell relatively locally in California, partly because post-Prohibition, California wine had been industrialized in the Central Valley and was churning out some pretty mediocre stuff, hence the bad reputation. As Patricia later said, our tasting put California wines on the map in America.
And it wasn't just New York calling. Eventually, global demand would pick up too. So it really gave Californian wine a crucial platform on the world stage at a critical time in its evolution. Going back to Chateau Montelena, though, it's a great story because the Barretts had only bought the property in 1972. It was a ghost winery post-Prohibition. Jim Barrett's plan was to make the Latour of California. In other words, focus on Cabernet Sauvignon. But they needed funds while they replanted the vineyard, so they bought Riesling and Chardonnay fruit to make cash flow wines.
The irony being that their second cash flow Chardonnay vintage, the 1973, ended up winning the Judgement of Paris, which they would never have expected. I asked Beau about the implications of their Chardonnay winning.
And the second one we made in 76, of course, goes on and wins the Paris tasting. And so off we go. So our dream to be just a, hallmark or a beacon of American wine excellence in red wine, the Latour of California, we're not going to, basically, we set a high standard of quality for ourselves on the Chardonnay. And so I guess just by luck of being in the right place at the right time with the right wine, that we decided to continue the Chardonnay program, which is eminently logical. I think you can agree to that. Yeah, it made a lot of sense. Yeah, keep making Chardonnay. So we did. But what was is that the New World wines had not really been invented yet. So to be a success, we were modeling our winemaking clearly on Émile Peynaud, the great book, Knowing and Making Wine. And the style of wine, which is basically boils down to the chemistry, the acid, alcohol, pH, the cleanliness, the sanitation. I think the cleanliness and sanitation is what the Americans really brought to the thing. Because if you think of those cellars in the old days, the French guys, they're smoking in the cellar and stuff like that. And, in the U.S., we got into the sanitation really hardcore because we were adapting out of the brewing and dairy industry was where we were buying our stainless steel fittings and stuff like that. So we really got into the sanitation, and I think that's where we did good because we had the land, the light, the fruit, the people with the work ethic, and we had everything in California that we needed to make really super high quality wines. And that's really what happened is that we just approached the classic winemaking with the American can-do attitude, and I think that clearly was successful in 1976, and I think that that's part of the result of the Paris tasting around the world is it made everybody strive for a higher quality. And I think that the real winner wasn't Chateau Montelena or Napa Valley. The real winner was the consumer around the world. It just made wines better.
Yeah, that's a lovely way of seeing it. Now, Beau, there was a film obviously made about the Judgement of Paris called Bottle Shock, starring Alan Rickman, Chris Pine and Bill Pullman. First thing first, what was it like having the very hunky Chris Pine play you in a Hollywood movie, and what were your reactions more generally to that film?
It's pretty surreal, because we were just doing our job, and it's like when they said we're going to make a movie about you guys, it's like, yeah, sure, okay. I thought they were pulling our leg, we thought it was, right, that'll never fly, and then they did, and so yeah, honestly, it's kind of surreal, but at the end of the day, how they sold my father and I on it, and how I sold Stephen on it, it was a love story to California wine, and that was what their mission objective was to tell a story. And we were very insistent that you can't make anybody look bad, especially the French, because that would be very unfair or just improper, I guess you would say here in Britain. That it just wouldn't be cricket or whatever you guys say. Anyway, we just we talked into it, but because of their mission profile to make the love story to American wine, show the togetherness of the industry of how all of us working in California built the business. It wasn't just Chateau Montelena. It wasn't just Stag's Leap. It was the entire Napa and Sonoma region. When we got there, we borrowed so much stuff from the Raymond brothers that started Raymond, or we'd go down to Robert and Davi and borrow stuff, and because we didn't have this equipment, so everybody would let us. They were helping us get started, and that particular part of the film was very important to my father and I, that they actually showed the togetherness of the early days of the Napa and Sonoma counties, where we really wanted everybody to succeed. And so basically that's how they talked us into it. So sure, they dramatize it, like my character is pretty flaky. And, I personally was always the first one to work and the last one to leave. I mean, I'm 72 and I'm still, here talking to you. So I like to work. But it was, in general, at the end of the day, it was, fun. and truly unique. And oddly enough, I know it's an overused phrase, but once in a lifetime experience. But anyway, but Chris Pine, I brag about that. I said I taught him how to be macho but sincere at the same time.
Macho but sincere. Love that. Bo is a great guy, as is his winemaker, Matt Crafton, who, of course, we've had on the pod before back in season 2. And they make serious wine.
Yeah. When they were over in the UK, we did a big tasting back to the 1976 Cabernet and the 2009 Chardonnay. They definitely focus at Chateau Montelena on an elegant style. The Chardonnay is quite restrained, but with lovely balance and freshness. And then the Cabernet is also sort of pared back in a Napa context. You can kind of feel the coolness of the Calistoga nights in the acidity and aromatics. It's kind of complex, age-worthy style. Funnily enough, Bo said that the Judgement of Paris Chardonnay win then funded their estate Cabernet program. It did force them, though, to continue with the whites, but he said they're lucky enough to work in a place that can do both, so maybe it's no bad thing.
But they've stuck to their guns, haven't they, making elegant, understated Chardonnay, where others have gone big on what Bo dismissively calls country club or cocktail Chardonnay, the sweet sort of buttery stuff. Yeah. And they've just made their first vineyard acquisition in 50 years to buy a vineyard for Chardonnay in Carneros. Yeah. So still sticking to their guns.
Yeah, good for them. But just to circle back to the Judgement of Paris tasting, Bo says the real winners were wine drinkers all around the world because it made producers strive for higher quality. It proved that if you work well in the right places, you could make wine that could compete with the best wherever you were in the world, potentially. So, it helped pave the way for the rise of quality New World winemaking, however you want to define that. But it also, crucially, gave a massive wake-up call to the French, who were arguably resting on their laurels at the time. Aubert de Villaine later described the tasting, he refused to call it a judgment, as un coup dans la derrière pour les vins français, a kick up the backside for French wine.
And I think, wine quality and diversity has positively blossomed since all around the world. So this really did mark a turning point. The Stag's Leap winemaker Warren Winiarski called it, and I quote, a Copernican moment. Nothing was the same after that. We looked at what we could do with different eyes. And that self-belief was really important and game-changing. After the tasting, some of the French reaction was sniffy, saying, well, the French wines were just young and needed age. But as many subsequent tastings have proved, including a 30th anniversary rerun of the Judgment with the exact same wines in both England and California in 2006, the Californian wines consistently shine, even with significant bottle age.
Yeah, it's such a good story. As you say, I love the sort of serendipity of it all, the almost sort of accidental nature of the whole thing. It's a sort of David versus Goliath kind of tale, but with a wine twist. And the way you have English, French and Californian involvement, even, I suppose, Croatian and Polish influence with Mike Gergich and Warren Winiarski. A truly multinational tale. And of course, we shouldn't forget the Greek reference, should we? The Judgement of Paris in its original sense is that fabulous story from Greek mythology about essentially a beauty contest when the goddesses Hera, Athena and Aphrodite challenged Trojan prince Paris to say who of them is the most beautiful. The Judgement of Paris is that he chooses Aphrodite because she's promised him the most beautiful woman in the world, Helen of Sparta. Big mistake. She's already married. Paris abducts her, triggering the Trojan War. Thousands dead. Troy pillaged. Paris dies. So 2 great stories, both featuring pride, beauty, and vengeance.
Yeah, who knew? So you can understand Aubert de Villaine not wanting to use the term judgment, but it is a very fitting title. Right, on that Greek mythological bombshell, time for a quick pause. To recap so far, the Judgement of Paris wine tasting in 1976 was a turning point in the world of wine. The unexpected triumph of unknown Californian wines against the French greats sent shockwaves reverberating around the wine world for decades to come. It led to a blossoming of quality wine production all around the world, including in France itself. The real winners were arguably wine drinkers, as a golden era of wine was ushered in by the democratisation of quality wine production around the world.
And that's precisely what we want to get into now. We're going to fast forward 50 years to explore the extent to which the wine world has changed since 1976 and perhaps hazard a guess as to where things might go from here, using a couple of tastings similar in style to that original Paris tasting as our points of departure.
And I guess one of the main points you could make to begin with is that California is no longer the blue-eyed boy of world wine. Back in 1976, it was this precocious upstart. Yes, it had some pedigree pre-prohibition, but in the early 70s, it was just getting back on its feet. Idealistic, freewheeling, ambitious in some respects, but also unproven, certainly cheap. Nowadays, it's a very different story. California and Napa are celebrated global wine hotspots, making some of the world's most acclaimed and expensive wines.
Yeah.
And the US market has now become the world's largest wine market.
Yeah, I mean, focusing on fine wine, I read recently that American wine now accounts for 8% of trade on the LiveX platform, which is the global fine wine exchange. And that's up from 1% 10 years ago, so 1 to 8%. And that's apparently mainly driven by top Napa wines. But it's still a really interesting trend, particularly given that, generally speaking, the French near monopoly on the secondary fine wine market has softened considerably in this time. So it's a real shift in global wine tectonics that we're seeing.
And of course, a further point you could make in this regard is a geopolitical or social one. You know how America's position in the world has changed radically from respected global policeman upholding the rule of law and globalism to pretty much the opposite.
Yeah.
That's not the fault of wine producers, and it could perhaps prove temporary. But it's a reality that's hard to ignore, especially in the light of this 50th anniversary. In his autobiography, Stephen Spurrier makes the point that the world of wine never stands still. Well, neither does the world of politics. And both worlds are very different places to 1976.
Yeah. So where to look for inspiration in 2026? Well, one tasting we were both privileged to judge in very recently was the Greatest Chardonnay Showdown at the London Wine Fair in May 2026. A stellar lineup of 18 influential palates featuring top masters of wine, buyers, journalists and sommeliers blind tasted 27 top Chardonnays from around the world, including Great Burgundy and Californians, and the results were intriguing.
Yes. We're going to explore this tasting in greater depth in a Wine Blast Plus episode coming very soon, because the results were so eye-opening. But long story short, the wine voted overall greatest Chardonnay of the world was from Tasmania, the Tolpuddle Vineyard 2023 Chardonnay from Coal River Valley. And the wine voted best emerging region Chardonnay, which came third overall in the voting, was English, the Danbury Ridge Octagon Block Chardonnay 2023 from Essex.
Yeah, some intriguing results. Looking at the bigger picture, Australia takes a lot of the credit here, doesn't it? As well as the Tolpuddle. The second wine overall was also Australian, the Vas Felix Heytesbury 2020 Chardonnay from Margaret River. Brilliant winery, brilliant winemaker who we featured in our Margaret River pod from season 6. So congratulations, Virginia. And then another Australian came seventh, the Shaw & Smith M3 2021 from the Adelaide Hills. Again, a wine we featured in our recent Adelaide Hills episode.
Yeah, so Australia staking its claim to modern Judgement of Paris-esque glory. And I think we pretty much go along with that. Australia has never made better wines than it is now, particularly with Chardonnay, but also things like Cabernet and Pinot Noir too. The prices are getting punchier, but not entirely across the board. And relatively speaking, they still offer very decent value. But then I also love the fact that an English Chardonnay, well, of course I do, an English Chardonnay came third overall. I mean, what a result that is. Despite some fierce international competition, a wine from Essex takes bronze. Again, another region we've covered on the podcast pretty recently.
Yeah, just to clarify, we had no hand in selecting these wines.
No.
It wasn't just a lineup of Wine Blast Hall of Famers. The people selecting the wines were Ronan Sayburn, MS, and Sarah Abbott, MW. Neither did we have any idea what wines would be included in the tasting.
It was really good, though,
really
wasn't
important
it?
to
really
say that.
Good. They made great choices.
We didn't know there was going to be English Chardonnay. We didn't know what was in there.
Didn't.
We were simply asked to evaluate the quality of a lineup of global Chardonnays, which we did. And the results speak for themselves. One thing I'd highlight is the fact that the South African Chardonnays performed notably well when value was taken into account. And South Africa had 2 wines in the top 5 best value Chardonnays, the Ataraxia 2024 and the Storm Ridge 2024, both from Walker Bay. And I had both of those in my top 5 overall, incidentally.
So we'll go into our personal results as well as the other rankings, including those for Burgundy and California in the upcoming dedicated episode on this. But Australia, South Africa and England as quality wine hotspots of the modern wine era, I have to say, sounds about right.
Yeah. And I know it's a different category, but when it comes to sparkling wine in last year's Battle of the Bubbles, the previous, London Wine Fair icon tasting, it was England that emerged triumphant, wasn't it? Taking the 2 top spots above the, some of the grand names of champagne, with actually California, South Africa and New Zealand delivering some great value. Again, we did a dedicated bonus episode on that one in season 6, another fascinating tasting, but another insight into how the wine world is moving on.
And on that note, we should move on, shouldn't we, to the tasting that you did with the International Wine and Food Society, or IWFS, with whom we did a recent episode on sparkling wine beyond champagne, of course. But they put together an ambitious series of more or less simultaneous tastings around the world to mark the 50th anniversary of the Judgement of Paris, with their members, who by and large aren't wine trade professionals, and other esteemed wine experts like you, Mr. Richards, passing judgment on a number of Chardonnays and Cabernets to come up with a modern verdict. How was it?
Yeah, it was another fascinating tasting. So the IWFS ran the tasting in 8 locations across the UK, Australia and South Africa, with I think it was about 221 members tasting and scoring the same flight of wines, 6 Chardonnays, 6 Cabernets or Bordeaux blends. They say it's the largest coordinated blind tasting ever organised. I don't know where we stand on that. Where Guinness,
we can't disprove that.
Fair enough. It was very ambitious. They did, they did other tastings too, involving apparently around 1,000 IWFS members in total, but not all of them did the exact same wines. But lots of involvement and celebration here. And at our tasting in London, Bella Spurrier, Stephen's wife, was there, so that was pretty poignant.
And what were the results?
The scores were very close, it's important to say, but the overall international result was a win for New Zealand in the Chardonnay category, the Kumu River Coddington Chardonnay 2024 taking top spot. And then actually California in the reds, with Schaefer's TD9 2019 coming top. The top 4 wines in the international verdict across both Chardonnay and Cabernet came from New Zealand, California, South Africa and Chile. So pretty widespread.
But no France in there?
No. But actually the Louis Jadot Pouligny Montrachet 2022 placed 3rd in the whites, but actually received the 2nd most amounts of favourite votes after the Kumu River. Plus, in my personal results, I have to say I actually had the Domaine Le Fleuve Macon Verzé 2022 as my top Chardonnay. And in the reds, my favourite was the Domaine de Chevalier 2017. So I personally...
France all the way.
I personally had 2 French wines as top of the 2 categories for me.
Just talking about that, why don't you remind us of all the wines being tasted there?
Yeah, good point. Sorry. So the Chardonnays from France, it was the Jadot Pouligny and the Le Fleuve Macon Verzé, then the Kumu River Coddington, plus Restless River Ava Marie 2020 from South Africa, Chateau Montelena 2022 from Napa, of course that one from the original tasting, and then Conche Toro Amelia 2023 from Limari in Chile. And the Bordeaux blends, the reds, were the Domaine de Chevalier 2017, Chateau Langoa Barton 2018 from France, the Schaefer TD9 from Napa, and then there was Nicolas Catena Zapata 2020 from Argentina, Canon Cop Paul Sauer 2019 from South Africa, and Mosswood Cabernet 2021 from Australia. And they chose all the wines for being good examples, but also not crazily expensive and relatively well distributed, so available globally.
So were there any other wines that you particularly rated highly?
So actually, South Africa performed pretty well for me. I've said France, but I did like the Restless River Chardonnay from South Africa. That was my 2nd favourite. And the Canon Cop Paul Sauer was also my 2nd favourite in the red. So for me, it was sort of France and South Africa did really well.
So again, looking at the bigger picture, the New World would seem to be the big winner in this context. New Zealand, California, South Africa all performing well.
Yeah, I think that's fair to say in the general results. really interesting results. And kudos to the IWFS for staging such an ambitious format. I mean, I think it reflects the modern wine world pretty well. So Stephen Harrison, the chair of the IWFS Europe Africa, said, and I quote, "Rather than seeking to copy what was done 50 years ago, we wanted to celebrate how much the world of wine has changed in half a century. World-class wine is now being produced across the globe," which, you know, I completely agree with. And then he added, "With such a narrow range of scores across the board, the IWFS verdict shows that we live in a golden age for wine lovers. We now have a glorious diversity of great wines and producers to choose from."
I think that's very well said.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm not sure wine producers would agree it's a golden age, given the many headwinds wine is facing right now, from declining consumption to climate change to the rising anti-alcohol lobby. But for those of us who are enthusiastic wine consumers, there's probably never been a better time to be a wine lover, has there?
I suppose one caveat would be price, something that isn't always discussed when it comes to blind wine tastings or judgments like this. You know, wine, like pretty much everything else in the world, has been going up in price lately, and it's not always easy to afford good wine these days, particularly, for example, for young people, which is part of the reason we're seeing a consumption drop-off among that demographic.
Totally, which is why we're constantly on the lookout for good value wines in any given context that we can champion or recommend. It is out there, and it was good to have those value champions flagged up in the London Wine Fair Chardonnay tasting and the Battle of the Bubbles too, incidentally.
Yeah, there were a couple of other tastings I'd like to mention in this context. We're lucky enough to do a fair few of these tastings, but ones I'd highlight particularly are the Cape Mentel International Cabernet and Cullen International Chardonnay tastings I did when I was out in Margaret River back in late 2024. Essentially, blind tastings of top Cabernets and Chardonnays from Margaret River and around the world. For the reds, my top wines, they were all the 2021 vintage, were Chateau Aubailly from Bordeaux, Spotswood Cabernet from Napa, Chateau Léoville Las Cazes from Bordeaux, Chateau Margaux, obviously Bordeaux, Yarra Yering Caradus Cabernet from the Yarra Valley, and the Cape Mentel Heritage Cabernet from Margaret River, and then finally the Te Mata Coleraine from New Zealand. And then for the Chardonnays, which were all 2020s, my top 7 featured 5 from Margaret River, the Deep Woods Estate Reserve, Vas Felix, Hatesbury, Fraser Gallup Palladian, Voyager MJW, Xanadu Reserve. And then my second was Penfold's Yatana, and 5th was the Shaw and Smith Lenswood, another one from our Adelaide Hills episode.
So those were all your personal results rather than the general results of the group?
Exactly, yeah. Sorry, I didn't sort of get the overall results, actually. I'm not sure they give them out. I think these tastings are more a sort of celebration rather than a judgment, but you know, a real privilege to be able to do.
Yeah, and another insight into how diverse top Chardonnay and Cabernet can be these days. And of course, we have to recognise in all this that Chardonnay and Cabernet are just two specific lenses through which to consider the wine world. Okay, they're two of the most widely planted grape varieties in the world, but equally, they're only a snapshot in their own rights.
Yeah.
And there's obviously so much more to modern global wine than Chardonnay and Cabernet.
Yeah, it's very well said. And I think, if anything, the modern wine world is heading more towards diversification than it is towards consolidation when it comes to grape varieties. So, you know, if we're talking Australia, now you're seeing grapes like Fiano, Valangina, you know, Vermentino, Grenache Blanc, Assyrtiko, Menthea, Nero d'Avola, Nebbiolo being planted and making increasingly exciting wines, especially in an era of climate change when traditional norms are just having to adapt.
And in a way that's great to see, isn't it? You know, because wine lovers are curious people who like to try new things.
Yeah.
And then talking of climate change, you've also got new regions emerging, like England, for example, but also places like cooler Canada, Tasmania, Patagonia, Scandinavia. So you can argue that the modern wine world is a place very much in flux right now. And who knows where the dust will settle and what will be all the rage in another 50 years' time.
Yeah, it's really difficult to predict. Coming back to the Judgement of Paris, though, there was a tasting in the US recently I saw called the 76 Redo. And to pick up on your point, they opened the initial selection process up to producers all over the US, not just California. So places like Virginia, New York, Texas, Pennsylvania. And they focused not just on Cabernet and Chardonnay, but also Chenin Blanc and Syrah. So again, you know, the world of wine never stands still.
And of course, to switch continents and to touch back on the judgment, you co-hosted some blind judgment tastings on a Chilean theme with Stephen Spurrier and Eduardo Chadwick, didn't you?
Yeah, so back in 2009, I co-hosted a rerun of the Berlin blind tasting where top Chilean Cabernets had beaten Great Bordeaux and other global cabs. That was in London, that one with Stephen and Eduardo Chadwick of Errázuriz, as you say, who had launched this ambitious global program of blind tastings to prove that his wines and top Chilean cabs in general deserve to be taken seriously on the world stage.
There was another one too, wasn't there?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, so Eduardo, flushed with his success from the original Berlin Tasting Global Tour, he put on another one in 2012. The three of us co-hosted a similar tasting, but this time focusing on older, aged vintages, both of Eduardo's wine Senya and top global Cabernets like Chateau Lafite and Sassicaia, Opus One, Latour, Solaya, and Margaux. I've got a lovely photo. In fact, it's just here. I can see it just here on the wall of the three of us at that tasting, looking very earnest, but also clearly enjoying ourselves with these magnificent wines.
This is it. We shouldn't lose sight of that, should we? Stephen certainly wouldn't want us to. That's the most important thing for all this talk of rankings and judgments and winners. We don't forget that wine is pleasure first and foremost. It's about bringing people together, conversations, food, fun, sure, intellectual curiosity and analytical engagement, but also just joy, celebrating life, not taking everything, including ourselves, too seriously.
And I think that is the perfect note to end on. By way of closing summary, the wine world is a very different place to when the 1976 Judgement of Paris tasting changed the game. Wine is more diverse, more global, more democratic, put simply, more delicious and more fun than ever. As wine continues to evolve, it's increasingly facing headwinds from climate change to declining global consumption. So who knows where we'll be in another 50 years' time? What's certain is that wine needs its champions more than ever. Anyone and everyone who, like Stephen Spurrier, thinks wine deserves celebrating and supporting and fighting for in a world where simple human pleasures are increasingly precious.
Amen to that. We'll put links and recommendations in our show notes, including to the various books that have informed this episode. Thanks to Bo Barrett of Chateau Montelena, and thanks to you for listening. Until next time, cheers.